Okay, I am back. Haven't made a video for 3 weeks, but I'm back now. Did you miss me? Did you? Did you miss me? Did you fuck? Go on, admit it. You didn't even notice I was gone. Did you? But I'm back now. I tend to take August off. I did that last summer. I don't even know if I made a single video in August. I think this will be my second video of the month, certainly the second pledge video. It's been, I think, the 7th of this month was the last time I recorded anything. What I want to do is sort of make a little bit of a catch-up video of 4 things that I've noticed. I must have been the last week I've not even been on YouTube at all, but the things that I've noticed in the news or on YouTube that I really wanted to comment on. So I'll subtitle this video Scum Thoughts. It's a kind of homage to an exchange I had back in 2012 with PZ Myers, where he said that I was scum and that everybody who watched my videos was scum. And I made a video just after that where I talked about an array of different things, and so I titled that Scum Thoughts. And now when I do the same kind of thing, I always subtitle that as Scum Thoughts. What I want to talk about in this video are 4 different things. I want to talk about the Google Memo. That was something that everybody talked about at the time, and I just want to get my thoughts out there with regard to that. Same thing with Donald Trump and his Charlotteville business. A little bit briefer on these other things perhaps than the Google Memo thing. I want to talk about the debate between Kristi Winters and the Distributist or the Distributionist or whatever it is. And I want to talk about something that I saw about the Australian Army only employing female applicants for certain roles, which I thought was kind of interesting, particularly a little debate that took place on an Australian program at the time over that. So those are the 4 things that I want to talk about. First one I'm going to talk about then is this Google Memo. Everybody had something to say about that, and what an interesting little turn of events that was. I think the first thing to say, because this is something that I was asked a few times on Twitter, is do I think that the guy deserved to be fired? Should he have been sacked from his employment, which is what actually happened? What I will say is this, I'm perhaps edging towards a yes, which you might find surprising, but I edge towards a yes. Let me tell you why. The first is this, is that we're talking about issues of diversity here. And let's be honest, when we're talking about companies, corporations, large organizations, they don't actually really, if we're going to be frank, value diversity. What they value is kind of the opposite. What they value is people getting on board with the corporate message, right? And whatever the corporate message is, they don't just want you to go along with a corporate message. What they really want actually is a kind of enthusiastic selling of the corporate message. And even when that corporate, if you was enthusiastic about one corporate message, if then the corporation goes through a periods of self-flagellation, we thought we were brilliant last year, now we think last year we were a load of crap, and now we're changing to this. They expect every employee to have a change of heart at the same moment and sing from the same hymn sheet as they do. Or at least if they don't, what they expect is that you're just going to shut the fuck up. Now, of course, they want some kind of diversity. If I'm going to be frank, what I mean by that is they don't just want a pink face espousing the corporate philosophy. They want a brown face espousing the corporate philosophy. They don't just want somebody in a pair of trousers espousing the corporate philosophy. They want somebody in a skirt or a slightly different tailored pair of trousers espousing the corporate philosophy. So there is a kind of diversity they want, and that is the kind of diversity that they're championing. But it's a fairly superficial kind of diversity. It's great in that it means that job opportunities are open for everybody, as they should be, based on merit, one would hope, whereas they clearly weren't in days gone by, and that's a good thing. But in terms of actually the ideas and the beliefs that are really what are important to us, that really define who we are, the idea that big corporations are interested in diversity is an absolute load of bollocks, let's be honest. That's pretty much the last thing that they want. And so with regard to this guy then, he had his opinions, and what he did was he made a memo and then emailed it to everybody in the fucking organisation, which is, I've got to say, I know where I work, if I was to do that, I would get at the very least a ticking off, right? I would be in trouble for doing that. That is not something that you are expected to do. If what you say pretty much just blows smoke up the arse of the organisation, well then you might get away with it. But other than that, you're going to be in trouble. And that's pretty much the basis of it. Now, there's another aspect to this, which is that once it gets in the public domain, all that this is about really is showing the company in good light, not employees not bringing the company into disrepute. So it's a simple fact of life that if what you have put in this memo that you've sent to everybody in your organisation, if the press pick up on it, then it doesn't become an issue of whether what you've said is right or wrong, scientifically right, scientifically wrong, morally right, morally wrong. Bollocks to all of that. Doesn't matter. Irrelevant. What matters now, you are at the whim of how the media deals with this, how they react to it, and as a consequence of how they react to it and how they portray what you've said, how everybody else reacts to it, I'm afraid. That's just kind of the way it works. So you end up with this situation where if it brings negative shit onto the company, then I'm afraid the chances are you're going to lose your job. And that doesn't matter. That doesn't just apply to what this guy says, and it doesn't even reflect in actual fact to the validity of what he said in any way, shape or form. It's just simply a matter of the reaction of the press. Sometimes you will get away with it. It's very difficult for a company. If the press makes a big thing and says, what a brave whistleblower this person is, bringing these things out in the open, then of course, what's the best thing the company can do? I mean, perhaps the nearest I can give you with regard to the emergency services in which I work, which is that we have standard operating procedures, certain ways that you're supposed to act, certain actions you're supposed to take at different incidents. And if you went way outside of those standard operating procedures, you could be severely disciplined, you might lose your job. But if you doing that saved a life, for example, and the press had you on the front page, local hero saves life, then not many employers under those circumstances are going to suspend you and seriously discipline you. Much better from their perspective to say, well, let's not bother talking about, let's sort of sweep all that crap under the carpet that they've gone against what we said they should do. Yeah, this is one of ours. Let's ride on the fucking good publicity that we can get out of this. And who would blame them for doing that? That's quite a natural thing to do. But in this case, that is not what happened. And the press, or at least the press that Google were concerned about, laid into the guy, and they regarded it as bad publicity. And so from their perspective, in many ways, who was responsible for his dismissal? He was part responsible for his dismissal. Because if you're going to send a memo out like that criticising the company, right, far and wide, you're taking a pretty fucking big risk. Unless you're really seriously stupid, you should know that potentially it doesn't matter whether what you're saying could be 100% copper-bottomed fact. You're still placing your employment in jeopardy because you're criticising your employer. The only chance you have of getting away with it at that point is if the press takes your side to such a degree that your employers effectively they break out the willow twigs and go into self-flagellation mode, which is something that I think we've seen quite a number of times over the last decade or so, in which case then your employer starts trumpeting you as this brave whistleblower who's brought them to their senses and starts lionizing you rather than anything else. But that isn't what has happened in this circumstance, and so effectively the guy is to some extent the architect of his own downfall. And yes, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that what I am doing there is victim blaming. I'm saying that he has put himself in a position of danger and he has to be held accountable by himself to some degree for that. If you're going to put yourself in that dangerous situation, then, well, what kind of do you expect? I would say the other people that are responsible, I would say, are quite a number of the journalists and the statements that they made, and actually some of the statements that came out of Google that Google put their rubber stamp on, which really grievously misrepresented some of the things that were in this memo. I would say it's the kind of thing which is like, if you read about the memo and then read the memo afterwards, it's hard to feel like you're reading the same thing that you were previously reading about. I mean, one of the comments that I heard quite regularly, which was that in some ways this was denigrating the women that were already doing these jobs, that they aren't good enough. Clearly the women that are working in software engineering, these tech jobs in Google, are not good enough. And yet the guy goes out of his way. This is what he wrote. He wrote, "Note, I'm not saying that all men differ from women in the following ways or that these differences are just. I'm simply stating that the distribution of preferences and abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes, and that these differences may explain why we don't see equal representation of women in tech and leadership. Many of these differences are small and there's significant overlap between men and women, so you can't say anything about an individual given these population level distributions." I don't know how you can make the points he makes, and it doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong, but I don't know how you can make the points you make and be any clearer about what it is you're saying and what it isn't you're saying than that, and yet that was still misrepresented. It was almost as if an NBA basketball player, a black guy who's 6'8", had been asked, why aren't there so many East Asian players in basketball? And he'd said, well, actually, if you look statistically, the average height of East Asian guys is lower than sub-Saharan African guys and Northern European guys, and so that's why they're statistically less represented. And that people have got, oh my God, what he's saying is that 6'10" Chinese guy who's in the same team as him is only actually 5'3". You know, you couldn't go any further to try and clarify that you're not denigrating any individual, and you're not saying individuals, you're just trying to explain a statistical imbalance, not saying anything about individuals, quite the opposite. In fact, when I printed this out, because there was a few bits that I wanted to comment on, was from the Gizmodo site, online magazine, journalism, newspaper, whatever you want to call it. They referred to it as an anti-diversity screed. There's a whole section in this where he talks about non-discriminatory ways to reduce the gender gap. He says, women on average show a higher interest in people and men in things. And then he says, we could make software engineering more people-orientated with pair programming and more collaboration. Women on average are more cooperative. Allow those exhibiting cooperative behaviour to thrive. Jesus fucking Christ, how could you be any more accommodating than that? Now, the interesting thing is, I've had discussions in the past about why, on my channel, on videos about why jobs like engineering, roles like engineering seem to attract more men. And one of the responses I got from somebody who regularly responds to me, who is one of the most progressive individuals who responds to me on a regular basis, said, well, Jim, maybe you need to take into account that the way that engineering courses are structured, the way that engineering departments, the way that people's engineering jobs and roles are structured is maybe partly a function of the fact that most engineers are men. Right, so maybe it's not intrinsic to the job of engineering, but effectively we're structuring those jobs in a way that appeals to men, and that those jobs could be structured differently so they appealed more to women without being any less effective than they are now. That's the exact same fucking argument that this guy is making, coming from a progressive, a very, very progressive person. This is just what this guy is saying. There are maybe legitimate ways that we could reduce these gaps, and yet this is regarded as an anti-equality, an anti-diversity screed. You know, I don't really know what you can say about that. If that isn't misrepresenting what somebody has to say, I don't know what is. Look, all I want to do is, I've told you I think that probably, given what happened, he deserved to be fired, but I thought there was a lot of very reasonable stuff in what he said. Let me just read you a couple of little bits that I wanted to comment on. What he says is differences in distributions of traits between men and women may in part, he says may in part. What he said is the difference in distribution of traits between men and women may in part explain why we don't have 50% representation of women in tech and leadership. How can you read all of this? Because he mentions this many times throughout it, and then we'll just ignore the in part bit. Because if you don't want to take that into account, then what you actually have is the extreme position, because you then have the position of saying it just can't be possible. It really cannot be possible. The differences that we see must entirely be due to cultural factors. And with regards to these cultural factors, he does a little paragraph later on where he says possible non-biased causes of the gender gap in tech. And he says, on average, men and women biologically differ in many ways, and talks about all this kind of stuff. So he's very much on the nature-nurture grounds. And a lot of the argument that's resulted, some of what he says in this memo, I found irrelevant. And a lot of the discussion that's followed I found irrelevant, because these discussions then evolved into discussions over nature-nurture. And can we say for absolute certain that despite the fact that every physiological measurable characteristic we can measure, we can put a number on between men and women above the cellular level, right? Okay, so, you know, a man's kidney cell might be the same as a woman's kidney cell, but everything else, height, body fat percentage, every single fucking thing that you can measure, men and women differ, but magically that could not possibly be the truth for any psychological factor whatsoever. They must all be born. Everybody seems to accept that men and women can be born differently, that we're all born with innate traits, but for some reason, there seems to be this magical reason why they must be exactly evenly spread between all of men and all of women. And I really need a very, very good argument if you want me to take that and not accept the fact that perhaps in part there could be a biological basis. But aside from that, nature and nurture is spectacularly irrelevant to this, because I don't know whether the people at Google who have commented on this, and that was my biggest beef, wasn't that they fired him, it was the bollocks that they talked alongside it. They could have just said, right, we don't expect our employees to talk out of turn like this and to send memos to everybody in the fucking organisation giving their socio-political perspective, and I'd go, fair enough. But they had to talk a load of trite, misrepresenting bollocks at the same time. But the point is, maybe they don't realise this, maybe most of the commentators don't realise this, maybe you don't realise this, but when Google employs people, they're employing people by and large that are in their 20s. They're not employing 2-year-olds, they're not employing people when they're 3 months fucking old, right? So what they're employing effectively is finished articles. Even if it is society, even if it is culture that is causing men to gravitate towards software engineering and tech subjects, and women to gravitate into fields like nursing, etc., etc. That's not Google's fucking fault. Google can only deal with the finished product. They can only deal with people that are being spewed out of the university system with degrees. And if the vast majority of those with the relevant qualifications, with the actual interest are men, well, it isn't their job to then cause some kind of discrimination and say, okay, so what we need is, we need 100 people to do this job. We need 100 recruits. Okay, so we're going to have 50 men and 50 women. Okay, what applicants have we got? Well, we've got 50 female applicants and we've got 5,000 male applicants. Okay, well, we better employ all the women, right? Don't just fucking employ them and we'll employ 1 in 100 men, because it's our job to try and make up for any possible bias that occurred to people when they were 18 months old, or when they were 3 years old, or when their teacher was talking to them when they were 6 fucking years old, because all they're doing then, of course, is adding another layer of discrimination. And there's also nothing to be gained. Acts of discrimination do not cancel one another out unless it involves the same individual. So maybe my grandfather or my father had some kind of benefit to being male, right? And if you want to then discriminate against them down the line, maybe there's some kind of fucking karma or balance in that. But saying to me, well, actually, your father had a fucking free run at this, or your grandfather had a free run of this, so actually, we're going to give you a much harder, we're going to make it hard for you, we're going to employ somebody else rather than you to try and make 2 wrongs make a right, because whenever you apply for a job, you apply as an individual. It's no benefit to you that for so many years men have had it good. And so we've got to sort of have a position to try and make things right again, which is something I'll come back to later on in this when I talk about the this Australian army thing. It's just a bizarre way of looking at things. It would be just as bizarre as if I was to say, well, do you know what? You know, as a father, fathers have been treated as second-class parents for that fucking long. Maybe we should have a period now when every time a mother goes into a shopping precinct, a shopping mall or whatever, right, she'll find that only men have access to the baby changing facilities, because 2 wrongs are going to make a right there. We need a period of discrimination against mothers to offset. No, because it's different mothers. Now, you're discriminating. Everybody does these things as individuals, whether you're a mother or father, or whether you're applying for a job. And having another generation of discrimination to sort of counteract a previous generation of discrimination doesn't really, that's just more fucking discrimination, I think. So I found that really frustrating. He talked about the politics of it, and about sort of left-wing politics and right-wing politics. He says neither side is 100% correct, and both viewpoints are necessary for a functioning society, or in this case, company. A company too far to the right may be slow to react, overly hierarchical and untrusting of others. In contrast, a company too far to the left will constantly be changing over diversity, its interests, and overly trust its employees or competitors. He's probably right. I think where he oversteps is he talks about later about not sort of pushing out conservatives or whatever. I kind of lost his thread with that. I think as a company, it's a kind of poor status to sort of, if as a company you want to adopt this position of neutrality over politics, left and right wing politics, as if each position is equally valid on every issue. The only way that you can do that is not to have a corporate stance on anything. And obviously that's kind of absurd there. There has to be a point where the business says, now this is our stance on this issue and this is our stance on that issue. What I would prefer is for companies to do that based on the facts and on taking a rational decision, not based on some pre-existing ideology, which then gets applied regardless of circumstance or regardless of the facts as they're facing. So the corporate philosophy may well be with regard to diversity. Diversity has to increase, and we must have equal representation at this point in the future. By 2030, we must have equal numbers of people of each gender, of each ethnicity. It all has to balance out regardless of any societal circumstances. And for me, That's placing, then now what you're doing is you're placing the politics above the reason for its own sake. Right, that's no good. But if making a sensible judgment means that the position that the company takes is a left-wing position or a right-wing position, then so be it. I don't see that as an intrinsically bad thing for a company to do. That seems an intrinsically sensible thing for the company to do. The other thing that I've said here that I just wanted to comment on that he'd said, I pretty much talked about what I wanted to talk about with regard to this. I'll move on to the other issues, but he talks about programs and mentoring and classes only for people with a certain gender or race. Yeah, you know, this has always been a particular bee in my bonnet, this one. Because it does seem to be the case that we have this, that the company will say something like, we're going to run assertiveness classes for female employees, something along those lines, because they've highlighted assertiveness as a characteristic which is useful to the individual within the company and therefore useful to the company as well, okay? And what they've said is, well, we've pinpointed that perhaps this is something that female employees would benefit more from. There'll be more female employees that would benefit from this than male employees. We'll run this for female employees. The point is, what are you saying is the problem here? Is the problem women? Is it female employees? Is that the issue, that really there's just an inherent intrinsic problem with women? Of course that isn't what you're saying, and even if that was what companies were thinking, they certainly wouldn't fucking well say it. So why is this kind of thing, how is it legitimate to highlight something as the issue? The issue isn't being a woman, is it? There's nothing intrinsically terrible about being a woman. We need to address being a woman. Of course not. Jesus, nobody's saying that, right? The issue is a lack of assertiveness. So if you're a male employee that has the same lack of assertiveness, what a kick in the bollocks that is, that your lack of assertiveness, well, that's just hard shit, right? We're not going to do anything about your lack of assertiveness. Why? Because there are other men within the organisation that don't have a lack of assertiveness. Again, how does that benefit you? You go to work for that company as an individual, and if you're looking for promotion or pay deal or anything else, you're competing against those other guys. They're not your mates. Well, they might be your mates, but again, in those circumstances, you're competing in them. And so you're hamstrung by your lack of assertiveness, the same as you would be if you were a female employee. And yet it seems to be a legitimate thing, or it's become a legitimate thing, to have courses like that we just aim as one group. And yet at the same time it's kind of double speak, because no, it's not being part of that group that's the problem, it's the characteristic that's the problem. Jesus, if it's the characteristic that's the problem, then give the training to whoever has that characteristic, not whoever happens to be a member of any particular group. That is what this guy is saying here, and that is something that I'm entirely on board with. If we're going to help people out, then let's help people who need it, and not try and do it as some mealy fucking back way of sort of fudging the statistics. Your employees aren't just statistics, and you shouldn't be helping your employees just to make your diversity statistics look better. That's just the very worst reason for doing it. If you're going to help your employees, do it because you want to help your employees, for crying out loud. And if you want to help your employees, then open it up to whoever needs it. And don't start discriminating on them on the grounds of, well, yeah, you could do with this, but you just don't make the diversity criteria, I'm afraid, bud. Okay, so I thought he had some legitimate points there. It was interesting, of course. There is this chilling effect because the top brass of Google came out and said, yeah, we're firing him. Well, he had some interesting things to say, and the kinds of things that we want to be able to discuss. But quite honestly, if you want to discuss them, I wouldn't fucking bother. If I was you, if I worked for Google, I wouldn't be discussing them. I would keep my mouth shut, quite honestly, because either I'd say it wrongly. You know, I mean, what happens if you just phrase it wrongly? Just not worth it, is it? So maybe there is some benefit as the Google top brass said to discussing it, but it's not worth it if you're employed there. I shouldn't bother. Toe the line, keep your mouth shut. That was the message that really came out of that. Just a very mealy-mouthed way of saying it. One of the other things that happened was this Donald Trump Charlotteville thing. I'm going to make a statement. I'm going to kick off with a little statement with this, which is to say that I abhor, condemn, and denounce neo-Nazism, the KKK, white nationalists, white supremacists, these absolute tossers who walk around with a fucking bulletproof vest and like a sort of militia. What a bunch of absolute twats they are. Walk around with their guns. That's just so pathetic. I can't but laugh at people like that, right? I have nothing good to say about those people. Why am I making that statement? Why not? Right? If this was a Muslim terrorist issue and this was a Muslim guy giving a video, there'd be a part of me that thinks, yeah, make a little fucking statement denouncing it at the beginning so we know where you stand. So I'm making my little statement so that there can be no debate about where we stand here with regard to that. The thing that I really found about all of this was Donald Trump's statement about, there's, aggravation on both sides and both sides are responsible. The thing that really disappointed me was with regard to the Antifa people on the other side. I fucking despise them. They are people, there are people out there looking for a fight. I know this coming from England because football for many years was fucking plagued by this. Fucking plagued by it. People going to football matches because they wanted a fucking rumble. They wanted to smash somebody in the face. They wanted to break somebody's nose. They wanted to draw some blood effectively, and that was their field of conquest. Unfortunately, people gravitate towards political organisations for that. That includes a lot of these white supremacist, white national twats. It also includes a lot of these Antifa people. And in both cases, what they're effectively doing is they're trying to take the moral high ground and say, we're doing it for good. And this is why I hate these Antifa people, because some of them are not doing it for good. They're doing it because they want to have a fight, because they want to smash somebody around the face, because they want to torch a car, because they want to put a fucking window through. It's just an excuse for them to be violent scum. And that's not a wrong thing to say. But by Christ, this was the wrong fucking time to say it. Because if there was one, for all the things that they've got involved in over the past year or so that have blown up, the silly fucking things where rioting and madness has occurred, people like Milo Yiannopoulos talking at a fucking university and it's ended in Antifa violence, right? And total, just using it as an excuse to fucking be violent. Those were the times to point it out. Effectively what Donald Trump is saying, he has used Stalin opposing Hitler as the right time to say what a cunt Stalin was. No, that would be the very, very worst time. When Stalin was actually the one time where he's like, yeah, okay, good on Stalin on that particular occasion. This is kind of the same thing here. Right, the very last time you want to be telling everybody what a bunch of cunts Antifa is when they're opposing actual fascists, actual neo-Nazis, actual scum. That's the problem. You know, when it was actually something that really did require maybe a high level of opposition, that wasn't the time to do that. And the regret of that, with regard to the Antifa side, is that effectively it's just shown them in a good light and just drawn attention and made them look like the heroes rather than the scum. And I'm not saying that obviously not everybody who's anti-fascist is scum. Of course they're not. I'm against fascism, for fuck's sake. But that isn't the people we're talking about. And we're not talking about people who go there and peacefully protest and have their say. Of course that's not what we're talking about here. So Donald Trump, what a fucking stupid, cuntish sort of own goal that was from my perspective, that he would do that. Two for one, he wasn't properly condemning what he needed to condemn. He wasn't making the statements that he needed to, and ended up watering down those statements and making it look like the condemnation he was making wasn't genuine. And a plague on his house for that, but a plague on his house again for adding some legitimacy to Antifa by making that his kind of hill to die on, if you like, with regard to that particular issue. Maybe it played to parts of his audience, and maybe that was the cynical way in which he did it, but it certainly left a pretty poor taste in my mouth on numerous levels. So that was the Donald Trump one. Let's talk next about the debate between the Distributist, I think, and Kristi Winters. And obviously this was kind of an interesting debate for me, because these are both people that I've had disagreements with over different issues, more so, of course, with Kristi than with the Distributist, or not necessarily more disagreements, maybe got as much common ground in some ways with Kristi as the Distributist, but there's always been a more nasty atmosphere about the exchanges that I've had with Kristi Winters than with the Distributist. And in fact, one of the things actually Kristi said in the lead up to this was how much she appreciated the way in which the Distributist had conducted himself, and the sort of the general atmosphere that had surrounded their exchanges. And I would say the same thing about the Distributist. So maybe that says more about Kristi than it does about the Distributist. I don't know. You can make your own mind up with regard to that. But the question that they were talking about, the resolution was, has the sexual revolution supported by second wave feminism been good for American society? Now, there was three things that I wanted to just mention on this. I'd probably mention more if I was making a video sort of more contemporaneously or just after the fact of the debate, but this is some weeks down the line now. But just things that occurred to me whilst I was listening to it. First off, the first was that there didn't seem to be enough differentiation. First, let me say that both of these people took this Oxford-style debate as a debate and set about, I think, using their understanding of how to get a political message across to score a win, right? It wasn't necessarily just about facts or anything like that. It was about a narrative and about selling that narrative, and they both went about that in different ways. The Distributist about sticking to his line and sticking to his line and sticking to his line and not getting drawn away. Kristi pulling with the heartstrings with the body autonomy line, I would say, which are both legitimate tactics to use, but that is effectively what they are. One of the things that I had was that I didn't really think that from the outset they differentiated what they meant by society, and there seemed to be some kind of confusion between the individual and society. Margaret Thatcher was springing to mind for those who are old enough to remember, and famously she made a comment years back, and I won't bother contextualizing it, but she made a comment about the fact that, effectively, to paraphrase her, society doesn't exist. There are just individuals, there are men, there are women, there are families, okay, and you need to look after your family, maybe look after the people next to you, but this whole idea of society, she said, was something of an illusion. I don't know whether that was right, but it sort of made me think about that to listen to this debate, because there seemed to be some conflict. Sometimes people seem to be talking, particularly Kristi perhaps, talking about individuals and what was of benefit to the individuals, without it being clear that this was of benefit to society, or even what that would mean. And if something's of benefit to every individual, does that necessarily mean it's of benefit to society? Because society is simply a bulk load of individuals, or do we regard society as some kind of superorganism, and so something on the societal level can be of benefit to society, but it isn't necessarily of benefit to the individual? So I found that a little bit confusing right from the outset. And let me just say, I watched this debate basically on Kristi's side. grieves me to say it, I'm basically on Kristi's side, because I agree with it's not that I wanted Kristi to win or lose, it was that I agree that I'm pleased that the sexual revolution took place, almost regardless of whether or not it was good for society. And part of that is because I don't think that is the be-all and end-all of everything. If we decided that democracy was actually not for the betterment of society, I think the distributist would then still argue, well, then let's go along with it. He'd say, no, I think as an individual you have a right to take part in a democratic process. Even if we could know, even if you could see into the future and say society would function better as a society under a different system, we have other things that supersede that, don't we? And that kind of comes into the business of happiness as well, or at least one of the things that I want to talk about with regard to that, actually, with regard to the way that societies are structured. Because the distributist's argument was based upon happiness. And what he was saying is that actually if you measure women's happiness since after the sexual revolution, they're actually less happy. Their happiness level has gone down to the level of men. And that might well be so. But I find that I don't find it a very useful metric, happiness. Kristi said something along the lines at one point in the debate that actually it's a very difficult thing to measure. I don't know about that, but what I do know is I've seen several examples over the years that show how situational happiness is, and how it's almost without any kind of datum point, our happiness. It's very much relative to where we've been and relative to our experiences. Two things that sprung to mind with regard to happiness was one, and I'll see if I can dig you the links out, I hope I can find them, was this study that showed that they looked at people that had lost a limb and they looked at people that had won $1 million and found that after a year or a couple of years there was no difference in happiness between losing a limb and winning $1 million. So in terms of the way that the distributist was arguing, we really shouldn't differentiate between slicing somebody's limb off effectively or giving them $1 million, because if our metric is simply happiness, down the line it makes absolutely no difference. Maybe it doesn't, but if he offers me the choice of $1 million, especially at the exchange rates that we're getting at the moment, thank you everybody who went for Brexit, or chopping one of my legs off, I'll take the $1 million, thank you very much. And another one, to go back to the political system, which is one I'd actually like to throw, I think, to the distributist. If he watches this video, I'll make him aware of it, is that when you look at the levels of political happiness in Western democracies, and in China, people in China are happier with their political system than we are with ours. So does he think that we should end democracy and go over to a one-party rule such as they have in China, because that may well increase our level of happiness down the line? I would suggest that he wouldn't, because my thoughts are that he would feel the same as me, that there are other higher goals in some ways, that we value our freedom, even if it even supersedes our level of happiness, and that we don't necessarily put our happiness as the be-all and end-all. One of the things in Nick Bostrom's book Superintelligence, which I read last year, is he talked about superintelligent computers, and if we told them, you know, we're going to create this superintelligence, or we think we might be creating a superintelligence that ends up lifting itself up by its own bootstraps, maximize human happiness, one decision it might take is to rewire all of our brains, to control us and rewire all of our brains so that we're in some kind of state of perpetual orgasm all the time. We just lay there gibbering on the floor with tubes down our neck keeping us alive while we have some kind of perma-orgasm. That would maximize our happiness, but is that a scenario that we would find edifying? Is that something that we would want to happen? Of course it isn't, because of course happiness is just one metric amongst many. And I don't think that happiness really holds any sway alongside the arguments that Kristi was making, because they're not based on happiness, they're based on our rights, and on our rights to experience the different flavours of human existence, and women being able to experience those flavours of human existence, especially because that's what she's concerned about, frankly, in situations where they couldn't beforehand. So that was the problem that I had with his side of the argument. Kristi made a big play on this bodily autonomy, and I found that pretty unconvincing, really. The Distributist picked her up on it slightly. As she was mentioning it, I was struck by this, and I thought, well, hang on a minute, whoa. The Distributist picked up on it quickly, but then left it. That left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth, because I really wanted it to be tackled on that, which was that she made... Talk about political arguments, you know. I mean, you see this with all these things. You saw that so Donald Trump's doing this, and you saw the Brexit sides doing this. Picking those arguments that pull at people's heartstrings, that have that emotional pull. And I think that's what Kristi did with bodily autonomy. Hey, I mean, you must be in favour of bodily autonomy, right? If you disagree with me, this was Kristi, if you disagree with me, then you're disagreeing with bodily autonomy. And who's going to do that? But of course, we all do that. The Distributist talked about with regard to drugs, and the drugs that we take, and the drugs that we can't take, and the drugs that are made illegal. I don't know what Kristi's perspective is on that, which is obviously an issue of bodily autonomy. But as well, you've got issues like alcohol and cigarettes, and certainly in the UK, the swinging levels of tax we're doing to try and out-tax the common person from being able to smoke anymore. Yeah, you can do it, but you can't afford to do it anymore. So effectively, for a lot of people, it's a sort of de facto ban on cigarettes. I don't know how she feels about that, but surely that's an issue of bodily autonomy, what substances you want to put inside your body. But there's lots of other things as well. We could talk about seatbelts, couldn't we, in cars? We could talk about motorcycle helmets. I'm allowed to buy a motorcycle but I'm not allowed to ride it down the road without putting a helmet on my head. They will force me to put a helmet on my head if I wish to actually use my motorcycle. And that's not actually for anybody else's safety, it's just for my safety. That is the nanny state saying to me, we have decided that you may make the wrong decision, so we're going to make the decision on your behalf and force you to wear a motorcycle helmet, force you to wear a seatbelt for your safety. And they're doing it purportedly for my benefit, but also, of course, for a societal benefit, you could say, in that they don't want to have to spend hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds looking after my fucking vegetative body when I've been paralysed from the fucking neck down in some crash. So there is perhaps some societal benefit to it as well, but it is undoubtedly taking away my bodily autonomy. How could anybody be in favour of seatbelts, mandatory seatbelt and helmet use, when it goes against our bodily autonomy? Now, that isn't me disagreeing with the position that Kristi was taking there, but I thought the bodily autonomy argument was a pretty weak one. Bodily autonomy is a factor that we take into account, but it's one we're very, very happy to leave to one side, and we do on a great number of occasions over a great number of societal issues. What I'd say is have a look at the debate, have a watch of it if you haven't. I'll leave a link and see what you make of it yourself. Let's move on to the last thing I wanted to talk about. And it was this business in the Australian Army, which some documents had been leaked, which showed that of 50 roles in the Australian Army, 35 of them had been marked down as only to be made available for female applicants in a bid to try and rig the statistics. Again, we're going back to this kind of position of two wrongs seemingly making a right. One group has perhaps, the contention has been discriminated at one period of time, so now we're going to have to discriminate against a totally different set of individuals now. And seemingly to those two different acts of discrimination against two different groups of individuals will magically make everything right, rather than saying let's just draw a line under the sand and treat everybody in a meritocratic way as individuals. It was interesting for a couple of reasons, this. The first was the response. It was a marvellous response, which was this came out and showed that what the documents leaked showed that they weren't going to recruit anybody for these different positions, and the army came back and said, oh no, we're accepting applications from men are quite able to apply, which was a beautiful piece of cynical attempt to wheedle out of something. And as it was reported, yes, they're able to apply, they just won't get the positions. That was effectively the position. You can imagine, you could go back to the Charlotteville thing we talked about earlier. I'm sure some of those white supremacists that were there run businesses, and I'm sure they will accept applications from black applicants, but they're just not going to give them the fucking job. And that was the case here. Unfortunately, in this case, the sheet was leaked and it was there in black and white, or in black and white and coloured pen or coloured highlight, to show which positions were currently recruiting for men and women, which positions were recruiting just for women. Kind of really strange thing to do that. And again, we're on the same kind of thing as we're talking about with the Google Memo, of trying to a degree to see some apparent injustice. Or even if there isn't apparent injustice, this is part of the problem, is that the statistics start to lead everything else. And quite rightly, we've gone from a scenario, whereas things in the military where only men could do these things, to trying to get to a scenario where you can do these things if you are capable. Some women are capable, so why the hell are we still discriminating against women and not allowing them to apply? To then going to this level down the line of saying, well, now when we look at the numbers, we've still got more men doing this job than women. That can't be right. Even in a job like the military, when there are some very, very great physical requirements involved. And we know that statistically, a much, much larger number of men will make those physical requirements than women. So everything else being equal, we would expect the vast majority of those roles to be fulfilled by men than we would by women, even taking account any mental, any psychological factors of preference or interest or abilities. Forget about all of that, purely on the physiological differences between men and women statistically. But seemingly there are some people that just won't take that. Once you've said that everybody's available, then it really doesn't matter. Ability is seemingly out the window. And to add on to another layer of that, what really motivated me, I would have made a video on this specifically had I been making videos throughout August, was a discussion that took place on a channel over in States where somebody was defending us. Let me show you a clip of this.
Well, you know, the Army should be recruiting the best person for the job, but why can't we assume that the best person for the job doesn't come from an all-female talent pool? For years and years, they've been hiring only men, and no one's been complaining about not having the best person for the job. So I say that when you've got 12% of people in the Army who are female, then clearly they need to readdress the balance. And hiring only women, surely the talent pool of women putting themselves forward for Army jobs is rich and full of talented women who meet the criteria, and I have every confidence in thinking that the best person for the job can come from an all-female talent pool, and with only 12% of women, the Army's really got no choice.
Strange watching that again. I don't watch that for a couple of weeks. I will say before I address what was said there, which is that I know that Australia has a system. I don't know if it's as differentiated as it is in the United States and the United Kingdom, where they have a kind of recruitment that certainly wouldn't be allowed in the United Kingdom under anything other than the military, which is, I think, what's sometimes referred to as a gender fair rather than a gender neutral system. Most things are sort of gender neutral, so it shouldn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. It's addressed on your characteristics. There are certain characteristics needed for that job. If you've got those characteristics, then you're suitable for the job, and if you haven't got those characteristics, then you're not suitable for the job. You can't say, well, a man has to have that characteristic, but a female applicant wouldn't. Or a female characteristic, would have to be really good looking, but a male characteristic can look like a piece of crap or something. Like, you couldn't have anything like that. So that's manifestly unfair. But the military doesn't work in that way. And in the United Kingdom, for example, male applicants have to be able to run faster than female applicants. I don't know whether that's because bullets aimed at men travel faster than bullets aimed at women. I don't know. You'd think if if a female soldier could perform a role and run 1.5 miles in 10 minutes, then a male soldier would be able to perform the role just as well, running at the same speed. But it's what's called a gender fair thing, and it's effectively saying, well, women can't run as fast or do as many pull-ups or as many push-ups, so how can you expect them to do so? Like I say, it would be obvious how ridiculous it was if we applied it to anything else. If we said, well, you want to be a professor of physics, so if you're very, very intelligent, we would expect you to have a PhD in physics and years of teaching experience. But obviously, if you're as thick as shit, right, you know, we can't expect you to have that, and we want to have an intellectually fair system. So if you're as thick as shit, you know, just a C grade in maths and English will be sufficient for you to be a professor of physics. You'd say, well, that's ridiculous. That's clearly not getting the best person for the job. But the military seems to have gone outside of that. I believe it's done that in Australia, but not quite to the same degree. But it's a really interesting sort of argument that this lady was making here with regard to this. And it really didn't make any sense, did it? I would agree with her. How can you say that the best applicant will not be a female applicant? But of course, the obvious thing, and the guy never comes back to her on this, is that, well, if a female applicant is the best applicant, then she will get the job, whether or not men are allowed to apply. It won't make any difference, will it? If she's the best applicant, she'll be the best applicant. And it's not an argument for reducing your field. You may as well say that only people with a surname over 8 letters long can apply for a job, because, hey, who's to say that somebody with a surname of 9 or more letters isn't going to be the best applicant? Well, of course, we're not saying that, but we're saying that maybe somebody with a shorter surname could be the best applicant, and it's the same thing here. To say that men should be allowed to apply for those jobs as well as women is not saying that women couldn't be the best. We're leaving it open-minded and saying let's allow everybody to apply and let's try and pick the best applicant. But let's be honest, when you're listening to this woman talk, she's mouthing the words. She's obviously not an idiot. She's a journalist. So she knows that she's being manipulative and misrepresenting it. She's mouthing the words best applicant. But what she means is satisfactory applicant. So what she's saying is effectively, if we need 30 people to do this job, I am sure there are 30 women out there who can do this job satisfactorily. And that is her justification for saying, as I've said before, we've had individuals discriminated against in favour in the past. Maybe your father applied to join the army and he didn't have to compete against women. So now we're going to discriminate against you. Because in some way, 2 acts of discrimination against 2 totally different people make 2 wrongs a right. I know it doesn't work, does it? It doesn't work in any circumstance, it doesn't work. But that's effectively the argument that's being made here. There was some discrimination in the past. Some people benefited from it. Okay, so we'll have some discrimination now. We're going to have 2 totally different sets of losers, and effectively that's going to make it right. This is a case that's happened here, which I think this is a pure example, one of the purest examples yet, of putting the statistics above everything else. So it doesn't really matter whether you're getting the right people for the job. It doesn't matter whether you're getting the best candidates. It's just simply about those stats. Stop looking at people as individuals. Stop looking at them as people. It doesn't matter. We're only interested in them as numbers on a sheet. And effectively, as far as that's concerned, right, does it even matter which women you get or which men you get? Just get 50 of each. And that's going to make the right figures, isn't it? And that's why it's such a terrible path to go down, because that is the logical conclusion. You still fulfill it. It's the same with fulfilling courses in universities. You don't even have to get the right ones. If you want to have engineering candidates, you don't even need to get men that love engineering and women that love engineering. All you need to do is get bums on seats that tick the right boxes in terms of sex and gender and skin colour and everything else. And it all looks right, doesn't it? You look at the statistics and you think, look at the progress we've made. We've gone from 5% men in nursing to 50% men in nursing. Look at this. But it doesn't tell the individual stories that perhaps to do that, you've had to get men to go into nursing that really didn't want to go into nursing. They wanted to do something else. And maybe now, you know, those 5,000 new nurses that you've took onto your recruitment program that year may be the least happy cohort in terms of their career preference than you've ever had. And yet, from a statistical point of view, it makes it look as if you've done some kind of progress. I found that really interesting with our Australian Army. I couldn't give a fuck about how well the Australian Army functions. That's their business. But it's a sorry state of affairs when we're getting down to that level. And of course, when you have a system like this, where clearly a lot more men apply for the armed forces than women, and a lot more men are physiologically capable of making the grade, you're almost going to get down to a point where you're going to say, effectively, if you're a woman and you can make those physical requirements, you're going to be in. And if you're a man and you can make those physical requirements, you might be up against another 200, 300 other individuals for your place. And that can't be fair, can it? It can't be fair to do it in those kind of ways. The only other thing that I wanted to say I apologise if this is slightly disjointed, but it's very relevant to this, is that there are different ways of making fair recruitment procedures, and they are fair, but there are almost different types of fair. And one way in which you can make your recruitment procedure fair and yet still give it the kind of balance you give it is to only allow people to excel at the parts that will give you the balance of candidates that you want. So, for example, let's say you have a job such as a military job, which has a physical role and an intellectual role. And you know that, just from the broad statistics, that if you make the physical requirements steep, that there are not going to be, that the vast majority of people who can make those requirements are going to be male applicants. And you want to get more female applicants. What you can do is you can have a fair system where you make the physical requirements fairly trivial and don't allow people to excel at the physical requirements. I know it seems strange. Why would you have any kind of recruitment procedure where you can't excel at all aspects of the recruitment? But what you do is you put a limit on that. And you say, this is the minimum standard, but it's also the maximum standard. If you can run twice as fast, lift twice as much, go on for twice as long, we're just not interested. As long as you can make that minimum standard. But then the other bits, maybe the interview or some psychological test, that's open-ended. You can really excel and show off all your skills with regard to that. You can end up with a system that is still fair. It's the same system for everybody, but it allows you to alter the recruitment balance in a way that achieves your political and socio-political goals that you're trying to achieve. Just something to consider if it's something that you hadn't considered before when you're evaluating the kind of recruitment procedures and how recruitment procedures have altered over the years. Okay, God, this must be about the longest video I've ever made. Thank you if you've made it till the end. Something a little bit more structured as we get back to normal next month, but I just wanted to go through these particular things. Okay. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.